All right, welcome. Excited to have the second talk of the morning at the first, as I heard, PowerShell Saturday here, Research Triangle. Yeah. So this session is called Using DBA Tools to Automate Database Migrations. If you're not familiar with database administration, that's fine. If you are, then you probably know more about database administration than I do. But this talk, we're basically going to go at the pace that works for everybody in the room. So if this is the first time being exposed to PowerShell, I'll explain some things that may help you along, even though it's not related to database administration. So we want to say thanks to our sponsors. Without them, probably couldn't have this event, take care of the food and some of the other niceties that we get here. So go ahead and talk to them, check them out, because they're here to talk to you. All right, so who am I? My name is Joshua Corrick. Most people call me Josh. I go by Josh Core on the Twitterverse. You can follow me there. I do blog from time to time, although I haven't as of late. I'm a systems engineer. I'm currently in the middle of actually transitioning to a different company. I am an accidental DBA. I never actually wanted to get into being a DBA. I remember we had like an internal lunch and learn that I had helped like kind of start at my company that I'm at currently. And we had some different people talk, and one guy talked about, hey, I want to teach everybody some basic SQL. And I was like, great, that's fine, come on, and I was more into PowerShell at the time. And he starts talking about T-SQL, and I'm just sitting there kind of falling asleep in this lunch and learn, thinking like, I'm never going to need to know how to do T-SQL because I don't ever want to be a database administrator. 6 months later, I was a database administrator. So I definitely come to this more as a PowerShell person than an actual database person. I'm passionate about PowerShell, and I'm a major contributor to the module that we're going to be talking about called DBA Tools. And all that really means is that I've just put in a bunch of pull requests, mainly for integration tests, which we won't talk about today, but more or less I've done more of the behind-the-scenes stuff to make sure that the module functions and is healthy and is hopefully free of bugs. So I have a question for everybody here. Who are you? So maybe just show of hands. So who is more of an IT pro or considers himself an IT pro generalist? Okay. Anybody actually a database administrator? That's their official job title? Okay. Anybody, is this like your first experience with PowerShell this weekend? Or fairly new? Fairly new? Okay. How many people would say maybe less than a year? Less than a year, okay. More than a year, but like less than 5 years? Okay. And then 5 years more? Okay. All right. I just want to get the temperature of the room just so that I'm going to try and walk through some basic stuff so that the new people to PowerShell don't get lost and like, what are you talking about? But I'm also going to hopefully have some stuff that people who've been doing it for a while can hopefully latch onto and like. So what are we talking about? What is DBA Tools? So DBA Tools is a tool set for managing Microsoft SQL servers. It's written in PowerShell, as well as there is some C#, and it is an open source PowerShell module, meaning that it is open for people in the community to get involved with. The website for the project is called dbatools.io, and it is actually run by our benevolent dictator for life, Chrissy Lemaire, and Rob Sewell, who's also in this photo. He is also one of the first people who jumped on board. They're both Microsoft MVPs, which means that Microsoft has recognized them as being major contributors to the community and major people that have helped move forward community and PowerShell or Microsoft products. Chrissy is actually a dual MVP. She's a data center MVP and a PowerShell MVP. Or sorry, data products. So she's like a SQL and a data center MVP. So it's pretty awesome. So there's also a handful of others, including myself. I've tried to get Lars to contribute, but I don't think he's done it yet. So
Not yet.
One day. But any one of you could absolutely give to this product. So the question is well, DBA Tools is open source and it's a community module, but isn't there something else already? Well, there are. So there's a couple different tools that are currently were out there, and I'm more or less going through a quick history. So we had SQL CMD. This was not PowerShell, but this is kind of like the built-in command line batch tool that you could use to do SQL queries, as well as different things within SQL Server. And this kind of came around 2008. Actually, maybe it was earlier than that, like 2005. But this is not PowerShell, right? This is not object-oriented. This is pretty much just like execute T-SQL, right? And it actually uses the OBDC driver. So there's a potential that if you wrote a query in T-SQL which used .NET, or sorry, if you wrote a T-SQL statement in SSMS, right, SQL Server Management Studio, and then you wrote a query and executed with SQL CMD, you would potentially get different results. Not different results in data, but different kind of functionality. So then they kind of developed a mini shell, which is known as SQL PS.exe. And this actually started to use some PowerShell, but it used like PowerShell snap-ins, which is the 2.0 version of a module. And this was very restrictive. It would be very like, you couldn't load that snap-in outside of the mini shell. You had to launch the mini shell and then you had to execute stuff within it. So it's more of like an interactive tool than an actual tool that you could use to automate things. Then we had the SQL Server snap-in, which is version 2.0, and there was a lot of grumbling about that because it, where SQL mini shell was very restrictive, the 2.0 scripts weren't any better. It was pretty much just one that you could load outside of it, but you couldn't do much more with it. Then we had SMO objects which were developed, and SMO objects are SQL management objects. And these are actually like the APIs that exist behind what is known as SQL Server Management Studio. So this is what Microsoft presented to the community as an opportunity. Say you're a vendor and you wanted to create your own custom SSMS plugin, right? You could use these SMO objects to actually interface and create your GUI tool, right? Because at the time that this is all being developed, Microsoft is still of the focus, make a GUI tool. We're all about Windows. We're all about, wizards to click through, right? So this SMO object was more of a developer's tool set than an actual like PowerShell tool set, but they've used these SMO objects to be behind their PowerShell module as well as DBA tools. So from there, we then get the SQL Server module, which has been shipped, I think, inside of the module, and now it's available from the PowerShell gallery. And the biggest complaint from this is that limited set of commandlets that you could use, slowly developed. So if somebody had a bug or a feature request, it would be months before you'd actually see it in the product, or even years, right? Wait for the next version of SQL to come out, in 2 years, and we'll get you that bug fix, right? And there are certain commandlets like invoke SQL CMD, which were kind of slow and buggy and couldn't do, parsing of certain things, as well as you couldn't output it into a specific custom data type. It had to come out as a data table, which if anybody has ever messed with data tables before is painful. You have to create your structure of what your data table looks like before you can actually fill it. And then filling it can even be problematic because you may have to iterate through that data set that you're getting as an object. So if you're trying to create variables and custom objects that you're messing around with SQL data into PowerShell, it can be problematic. So as a result of this, everybody's like, oh yeah, these are fine, these are fine tools. DBA Tools was kind of developed in somewhat of a response to this, to the slowness that Microsoft was doing, as well as to some specific use cases. So what makes DBA Tools different, right? Well, first off, it's community built. There's over 160 community contributors that have done everything from entire modules or very specific modules to, like myself, just mainly writing integration tests and or doing kind of some cleanup work to prep for version 1.0, which was just released. It's open for user review. So it's out on GitHub. You should be able to understand what's going on. There are some C# pieces that are compiled just because they run more performant faster if they're C# and compiled, but you can still see that C# code on GitHub and do pull requests and reviews of it. It is code signed, so if you're in a very secure environment and you have a security team that's worried about what kind of PowerShell is running in your environment and you have signed only settings turned on for PowerShell execution, this PowerShell module, as downloaded from the PowerShell gallery, is signed by a code signing cert. And I believe Christy is the only one who has access to that code. So you can have kind of a high level of confidence that if you download it from the gallery, it's signed and it's validated. If you download it from GitHub, which you can do, it's not signed, so just know that as a caveat. The module is trying to codify best practices. So as it's community built, so the people who are using SQL Server are saying, hey, let's build this tool. They're then saying, well, there's no tool that exists for making sure that the power plan is set to high performance. So let's make a tool that says, let's test to make sure that the power plan on every SQL server is set to high performance. It's like one of those random Stack Overflow articles you might read, and you're like, why is it constantly spiking whenever we do this query with the CPU, right? And it's a known bug. So also the focus is on ease of use, right? If you're new to PowerShell, this should be easy to use. If you're more of a data professional who's never touched PowerShell, this should help you, or should be a tool set that you as a data professional would want to use or would think of using. And be intuitive enough that you don't have to go, man, what is my SQL instance, right? It has some intelligence sometimes to actually reach out and figure out what your SQL instance you're trying to look for. And or if you're connected to a SQL instance, you're like, what is the name of that database? I can't remember because I have like 100 databases on this one instance, right? You can potentially tab through those database instances as a parameter rather than having to go to SSMS and type in or do a get DBA database. It's also trying to move towards automating like all of the things. Automating your server setups, automating your backups, automating your tool deployments, automating your migrations, which we're going to talk about in our demos today. So DBA tool aims really to support as many configurations as possible. So we go back to PowerShell version 3 and above, right? So we also support PowerShell Core, which if you're not familiar with that, that is basically a version of PowerShell from version 6 onto version 7 now, which is in preview, that runs off of .NET Core. And .NET Core pulls out a couple things that Windows PowerShell relied on. So PowerShell Core now runs on Mac and runs on Linux and also runs on Windows, but with a subset of what is available. So our module then supports running on Mac and running on Linux and running on PowerShell Core that's on Windows. Some commandlets aren't available, which just makes sense. Some of the ones that are more Windows specific, so like domain checking and stuff like that, which you wouldn't expect in a Linux environment, you can, but you wouldn't expect that. So those commandlets have kind of been removed when you load the module on a Linux machine. We support SQL Server 2000 all the way up to 2017. Now, commandlet support is kind of limited back to the 2000 ones, which I hope nobody's running. But it is there because we know people still have those in their environments. We support Express, up to data center editions of SQL Server. Some of the commandlets may not work, and that's just because they rely on a feature that is only available in standard or enterprise editions. It also supports Windows and SQL authentication, as well as supporting MFA. So if you're trying to get to like Azure AD, it supports auth to databases that are behind Azure AD. It supports databases that are behind Azure AD MFA as well. So pretty much if you go to SQL Server Management Studio and you hit the drop-down of authentication methods, we want to try and support every single one of those authentication methods that are in that window. It supports other things that you would take for granted, right? Default named instances, multiple instances on one server, as well as alternate methods of authentication like we just talked about. All right, so I've spent probably about enough time actually going over just the basic base from Microsoft and then what the community has built. Any questions at this point before we dive into demos? I just want to answer anything. Yes?
Is it more Azure geared or on-prem?
Yeah, so it's all about SQL Server. So the question was, is it mainly Azure focused or on-prem focused? And the module is focused to just be databases, right? So it's irregardless of if your database is running in a VM in Azure or running on a VM in AWS or running on a VM in your data center, in New York or wherever your databases are, right? If it can get to 1433, then it should be working fine. Most of the commandlets will work. Any other questions?
Can it address paths, SQL paths?
SQL paths. So the question was about SQL paths. Could you go into that a little bit further?
The SQL DB, Azure SQL DB, and Azure
Yes.
managed instances.
Yes. So managed instances like the platform as a service. Yes, I believe we do support that. It's connecting to those databases because again, it's as long as it's looking at the database layer, not at the OS layer necessarily. There are some commandlets that we've written that do address the OS layer, but for the most part, they are interfacing with the actual database. So if it doesn't care if it's a service or if it's a actual hosted VM, right? It's just trying to connect to the database service. Any other questions? All right, cool. So the demos that we're going to do, we're going to try and step through a couple different things. I didn't want to go too deep into a deep dive of like, this is the internals of how it all works, although we can do a little bit of that if anybody's interested. This is mainly just kind of introducing you to DBA tools for new people, how to install DBA tools, right? That's a great place to start. We're going to look at migrating some databases from one instance to another instance. We're going to migrate some more databases, right? Because this is called migrating databases. And then we're going to talk a little bit about internals, just more or less a breakdown of how some of these commandlets work. And then we're going to look at some offline alternatives, as well as some large database alternatives. So does anybody who's a database administrator deal with like 1 terabyte or larger databases, right? So if you're thinking about migrating those instances, your downtime window may not be as gracious as the university that I work for, where we have almost all of Sunday to bring a database down and nobody cares, right? You may be in the environment where you have to have it less than 5 minutes cut over time, right? So we'll talk about that. We won't do any demos specifically on that, but I feel like I have to mention that since that is a thing that people do a lot of. All right, so before we do that, let's go ahead and switch over here if I can. All right. So one thing I wanted to show before we get started is you can go to, I already gave the dbatools.io website, but you can go to docs.dbatools.io. And this is a great place where it actually walks through all the commands, and you can actually look through this to figure out what specifically you're looking for, as well as they have some helpful articles here about offline installs of DBA tools and other tools to get started with. So just a brief talk about our lab environment here. I have a domain controller. I have a couple of SQL instances, and if you haven't seen it yet, I definitely have a SQL 2008 R2. Don't tell my boss about that. If you don't know, SQL 2008 R2 was end of life back in July, so it's no longer supported. So if you're running it, you're at risk. You should migrate. So what we're going to do, good thing about this presentation, is we're going to get off of that 2008 R2 box, and hopefully we'll delete that VM by the end of this demo. So I can tell my boss that we're in compliance, right? All right, so I'm going to be running all these commandlets from Windows 10, which I have a tool here called Visual Studio Code. I feel like that's pretty standard, but if you're new to PowerShell, this is a tool that a lot of people use, as it has a built-in shell and it has a code editor and some syntax stuff. One thing that I like to do, and we'll do this really quickly here, is there's a screencast mode, so I can kind of start typing stuff, and people will start seeing on screen what I'm actually typing.
That's cool.
So we'll do that, and if it gets too annoying, I can turn it off. But I feel like it helps because if I do a keyboard shortcut, you're like, wait, what did he just do? So hopefully that'll help. And also, a lot of people like this dark theme. I use a dark theme a lot of times, but there's also, let's see, there's also, if you get the PowerShell plugin, there's a PowerShell ISE theme. I mean, who likes PowerShell ISE, right? Right? Team ISE? Okay. I'm alone. All right. So, more or less, one of the questions I get asked a lot of times about DBA tools is just like, well, do I need to install this module on my SQL servers, right? No. This is like SSMS, right? Don't install SSMS on your servers. Don't install this module on your servers, right? Unless that server happens to be like your management server that you do all of your work from, right? Think of this as that, right? Install this module where you're going to work from in your day-to-day to reach out to your nodes or to your instances. We are also going to change this really quick, change the prompt, which I like to do because then it gives a little bit more focus for the commandlets. That's what we're here for. And just again, can everybody see this? This is great size? Okay. All right, so let's start with the basics. So I can't do this in this current environment because this is a closed off network because it's a domain controller, and I would get in trouble at work if I just happened to plug this into the network, right? And my domain controller was starting to replicate from other domain controllers. So if you're on your box, you can actually go ahead and do install module Dbatools. On version 5.1 and later, you can actually do the scope parameter. So if you're not an admin on your box, a local admin I should say, you can now use this parameter to install Dbatools or whatever PowerShell module you need to within your current C user's username documents folder path. Once you have Dbatools installed, you can actually do update module, and this will go out to the PowerShell gallery and download the latest PowerShell module that you need and keep it up to date. Again, I mentioned you can also actually manually go and download the module from github.com, but be aware that that's like the bleeding edge. PowerShell gallery isn't that much far behind what is in the master branch out there. Like for example, I downloaded version 46, I believe, and they already updated to 47 within 2 days. So I just downloaded the latest version and I'm already out of date. So just be aware of that. All right, so what we're gonna do first is we're gonna import the module because I've already downloaded it. And that was actually pretty fast, which I'm kind of scared about. All right, so here we go. We did get module, which will show us our currently loaded modules. And you can see we have version 1.0.46. And then the question too is, well, the SQL Server Management module has like, I want to say 120 commandlets. Currently, Dbatools, this is just using get command, has 574. Closely approaching 600. And that's, I believe, just the externally exposed commandlets. We have a bunch of internal commandlets that we use to kind of do different things inside of the modules. Plenty of stuff here. If you were just looking at get command and looking at the module and you're trying to look at for migration commands, right? Because that's what we're doing today. We're trying to migrate from our 2008 box to this get command, which is a PowerShell commandlet. We use the term migration, right? We only find one commandlet. But Dbatools has a cool commandlet called find DBA command, which actually does regex patterns throughout the entire module. So not just the command name, but the actual help file in the command. And even we do tagging. So if I just look for the pattern of migration, which you don't have to put any stars around it because it does some of the auto regexing, regular expressions, you can see that there's a lot of stuff in here that either names migration or has migration in the help. That we're going to take a look at. So there's a lot of copies here, exports, and restores, and start DBA migration, which we found that commandlet before. So we're gonna actually look at start DBA migration. Another thing that's cool is you can actually do a tag. So if you're looking for a specific thing like migration, this will return anything that has the specific tag in migration. Or say, for example, you're looking for AGs, right, availability groups. You can also do that as well, and that'll bring back all the commandlets that specifically deal with that specific feature. So if you're working with something else, there's like almost 600 commandlets here. I don't think I've even used all 600 commandlets. So, be on the lookout to use this as a tool to find what you need. So, also, part of the basics is your credentials, right? So I'm currently logged in with the credentials that I'm going to do all these demos with, right? I'm using Kerberos. It's an AD joined machine, but say you have some alternative credentials. And actually, let me toggle off screencast really quick, because if I have screencast on and I start typing in my credentials, you guys are going to see my password because I have this helpful tool turned on. So I'm turning that off. I don't want you, not that I'm using these credentials anywhere else, but it's just funny. All right, so say for instance we have another domain user, we can do get credential for that username. And you can do this also as user principal name. It doesn't have to be the domain /user. And then we can put in our credentials for that user. Now, also, if you're doing SQL credentials, we could do get credential again without providing the username. And we could say, hey, I want to do this as SA, right? Because we're all logging into our SQL instances with SA, right? I'm being sarcastic. Don't do that. Don't do that. This is a demo too, right? So what we can do is, if you're logged in as a Kerberos session, on most of these DBA tool commandlets, you don't have to do -SQL credential. It'll just say, who are you logged in with? Let me try with who you're logged in with, right? Just like if you're logged in with SSMS, right? You log in the one time and then you don't have to think about your credentials again, right? So this is a way in which if you are using any alternative credentials and you're using DBA tools, it can get confusing if you're trying to execute it as one person and then you're like, oh wait, no, I meant to run this command as this person, right? You have to use a -SQL credential. Well, I'm kind of lazy. And so I decided to use this PowerShell built-in thing, which is PS default parameter values. And inside of these brackets, I'm basically saying what command I want to have a default parameter for. And you can create this as a whole list, right? In fact, I think you can even do this not as a commandlet, but just as anytime you see SQL credential, give it this credential. So we've already stored our SA credentials in this one variable. So now we're actually going to create this default variable. And I'll show you why we're doing that here in a second. So another thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually do some queries just as a basic DBA tools thing. So this is actually in PowerShell, it's called a here string. And if you're a DBA or if you're somebody who is used to writing SQL in SSMS, you like to have it formatted very nicely. You like to do select, return from, return where, right? So you don't have to do this when you're using PowerShell, but I tend to do this because I like to write out my SQL query first and be able to read it like I usually would read SSMS, right? The caveat of having a here string is you have to basically have your variable name, and then you have an @ double quote, and then you have to have a return, fill it with whatever text you want, and then when you want to close it out, you basically have to do a carriage return and hit the reverse, right? Double quote and then @. So this is going to be our query that we're going to use for 2 different executions. So now that we have that, we can actually go ahead and do our invoke query. Do you guys want me to turn the keyboard mode back on where you guys see what I'm typing at all, or is that too annoying? Okay. So we'll turn the screencast mode back on. All right, so now from this point, we're going to actually execute this invoke DBA query, and this time we're going to use those credentials. So we're using those alternative domain credentials. So we went ahead and executed that, and we got back what we were expecting, right? Some stuff from the worldwide importers database that everybody loves. And if you look at this, I'm actually going to select original login, which shows me who I'm executing this command as. And you can see I'm executing it as Astrid. Now, if I execute the same command again, but I don't provide that SQL credential cred, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to default to who I am? I think so, but we also did this PS default parameter values. So for this specific commandlet, to say if you do invoke DBA query, run it as this SA account. So we'll actually see what happens because it's a good question. I think it's going to work. I'm hopeful it's going to work. And we'll actually highlight both of these lines so that we can just execute it all at once. And it didn't like my query, but it did say that I am executing as SA. So because I saved that as a default parameter. So again, this is just more or less basics, just some quick tips and tricks for maybe some of you who are more familiar with DBA tools. I wanted you to get something out of this. All right, so that's the basics. And we still got some good time. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the rest of this. So let's look at Start DBA Migration. This is what is considered the easy button migration for DBA tools, where essentially you pretty much just give it your source, your destination, you hit enter, and it goes ahead and does a bunch of stuff for you. So we have a couple different instances. Of course, we have our 2008 instance, which we want to get off of. We have our destination 1, which is actually a 2016 box. And then we have destination 2. Now there's a couple different ways you can connect to database instances. You can use this connect DBA instance commandlet. And what that does is it connects to the database and it creates, pulls back some objects about that database. Or you can just create it as a string variable, right? And it'll do all of that under the hood when you go to use a commandlet. So you don't have to use connect DBA instance, but I wanted to show you that because we can get different things out of here. So if we look at source, right, we actually have objects that come back. But if we just look at our variable, right, we just get a string, right? So that's kind of the difference, is that if you wanted to get an early look, you could use Connect DBA instance to get information about that database. So currently what we have on our source DB is we have 2 user databases. We have Ye Old Time Adventure Works, and we have Who Wrote This App AW2008R2. So 2 apps that we have to get off of this old system, and we have to move. Then we have a couple other, this is our destination, right? So I wanted to show you that technically destination 1 does have some databases, right? Let's make sure. Yes, does have some databases already there, right? We have worldwide importers there, and we have a report server. But destination 2 doesn't show up in this list, right? So destination 2 has no user databases. So we'll use that kind of as a test after we migrate our databases. I wanted to show you there's nothing up my sleeves, nothing behind my back, Man, this is a tough crowd. All right. So start DBA migration, like I said, is the easy button. And so you can exclude stuff from this easy button if you want to. So if you look at get help for start DBA migration, and we look at the parameter exclude, you can see that these are all the different things that you could exclude from start DBA migration. So you can exclude databases, logins, agent servers, credentials, link servers, SP configures, central management server, database, sysdb user objects, system triggers, backup devices, audits, endpoints, extended events, policy management, resource governor, server audit specifications, custom errors, data collectors, startup procedures, and agent server properties. That's a lot of stuff. That's like 20 different things at a minimum. And it's good to know this because say you're in a 2008 R2 environment, right, that you're migrating away from. Well, it doesn't support extended events. So if you know that by default, you're like, hey, I'm not going to do extended events as a thing. I'm going to just exclude that from my run. All right. So there's 2 actual methods that start DBA migration supports. There's the backup and restore method, which depending on your environment, if you're trying to do something, say like push production down to a QA environment, right? This may be a good environment to kind of do that, right? You're backing up your databases. You're not pulling them out, and you can actually do copy-only data backups as well. Or you can say, hey, use my last backup set, so you're not actually running a backup on your instance. And it'll copy everything over. The requirements of this is that you actually have a shared path for the backups to be copied to that both instances have access to. So whether that's the SQL Server service account that has access to that share, or in our 2008 environment, unfortunately, we have it running as network service, which you shouldn't be doing. But because it's running as network service, it can connect to that file share. So we can go ahead and actually copy the backups over to that. And then we have some exclusions here because I know these objects don't exist and I don't want to migrate them during this demo. So if we just do this, we can actually hit F8 and it is running. So we should get some text put out to the screen here, but this is pretty seamless. And what is actually going on under the hoods is this is more or less just a wrapper function that is wrapping up a bunch of other commandlets that are already in the module that you can use one-off, right? So this is basically taking all of those other commandlets we've written and rolling it up into an easy button. So let's see what was copied. So we copied a whole bunch of configuration values for the server, right? You can not do that if you want to. Lots of configuration values. More configuration values. Here we go. So we got our databases migrated successfully, right? And then we got any logins that may be supported by that application that were copied as well. I don't actually have any service accounts that were on that instance, but say you're in a production environment where you actually have service accounts that run apps, then yeah, you would have it. And it gives you warnings if it was skipped, so already exists on destination. This is a local machine name, so those aren't going to be copied, right? Because that would be bad if you copied over a production database's local machine name. Some things aren't supported yet, but will be in the future. So if we now look at our 2 database instances, and I didn't want to do that, man. That's the one thing about this, is it scrolls super fast. we're going to look at our source and at our destination and just pull back what databases exist, right? So since this was a backup and restore, right, the database instances are untouched in some regard over on that original source server. And as you can see, they're now present on our production server, or our soon-to-be 2016 production server. So another method that is supported, the second method, is called the detach, copy, and restore. And this one works a little seamless, a little easier in some circumstances. So say you don't have a service account running SQL Server in a newer version, and you don't want to go through the hassle of changing out to be a service account and then connecting it to a file share. This will actually detach the databases from your source, copy it over via UNC admin share to the destination host, to that default data directories for the logs, for the master, and then reattach it into that instance.
So you said UNC admin share?
Yes.
So that's on the system volume, then you'd have to have enough space there.
Yes, you would, yeah. But I mean, you'd have to have the same amount of volume to run it. And what I say by UNC admin shares is that, so say the data is in data database files, right, for the MDF files. Then it would copy it to the destination path where that SQL instance usually runs its data files from. So there has to be enough space on the D drive or the E drive, right, for data and logs if you split it up that way. So you don't have to necessarily have the space on the C system drive to copy it over.
Okay.
But you do then have to have those permissions, right? You have to be able to connect to it in that instance or in that way. Or have a service account that can do that. And again, I'm not going to run this now because we're going to look a little bit deeper into how this works in another commandlet. But this is the second way. I actually have a database, an accidental database administrator that I work with that is using some of these commandlets this Sunday to migrate our SharePoint databases from one instance to another. Right now, he's only doing the databases because we determined we don't want to copy any of the other objects, and that's what we'll be looking at next. But we did this the other day for our dev environment, which is just as big as our production SharePoint environment, and we were done copying databases over in 15 minutes. I just got to say, the last time I had to migrate those databases, I had to write this T-SQL statement to do the detach, to do the copy. I opened 2 file explorers, I highlighted, copied, and pasted. That took me 2 weekends of like 4-hour each maintenance windows to get that done because of bugs that I encountered and things I wasn't worrying about. I wish I had known about this command at that time because it would have been so much easier. All right, so that's the end of looking at Start DBA Migration. Let's look a little bit inside of what Start DBA Migration contains. So like I said, it's a wrapper function. It's the easy button. If you wanted to do any one of these by themselves, you have all of these copy commands. So these are the 20 commandlets that are encased inside of Start DBA Migration. You're having your agent server copied over, your backup devices, your credentials. The copy DBA credential is kind of cool because I've ran into scenarios where we have a DBA credential on the box that was set up and is running in production as a web app credential that nobody has access to. The app is compiled, nobody has a source code for it. And essentially, we have to move this, but we don't know if we're going to break anything and we don't have the password for the service account. I mean, that sounds bad, right? Copy DBA credential uses some black magic to reach into the registry, find those credentials, copy it out, and reinsert it into your destination instance.
So it's not the same thing as copy DBA login?
No, it's different.
So this is for the service account that's running? Explain that again.
No, so DBA credentials is inside of, if you're looking in SQL Server Management Studio, it's in server objects. The app is compiled, nobody has a source code for it. And essentially, we have to move this, but we don't know if we're going to break anything and we don't have the password for the service account. I mean, that sounds bad, right? Copy DBA credential uses some black magic to reach into the registry, find those credentials, copy it out, and reinsert it into your destination instance.
So it's not the same thing as copy DBA login?
No, it's different.
So this is for the service account that's running? Explain that again.
No, so DBA credentials is inside of, if you're looking in SQL Server Management Studio, it's in server objects. and then it's under credentials, and you can store a credential in there, and then you can use it to execute
Oh, for
agent
proxy,
jobs.
right?
You can, yeah, for proxies as well.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's the kind of harnessing, and it's like once it's in there, you can't read that password out, right? This uses some black magic, like I said, to reach in, find it in the registry, and move it over into the other instance. So a lot of copy commands here, and the one that the database administrator I work with is going to use this weekend is copy DBA database, right? Same kind of parameters we looked at before, source, destination, and then a couple other parameters. And this is going to take care of the work for him. There's some other ones that are really handy too, like copy DBA DB mail. So if you have your mail settings set up on one environment, you can easily migrate those over to your other environments. Sometimes what I actually have, and this is more like deployment stuff too, right? I have a kind of golden standard management server that I have that has like backup maintenance solutions already there and backup maintenance solution jobs, agent jobs that I like, that are already configured the way we've already defined that one place. We can easily use these commandlets to deploy it down to new instances once we spin them up into production. So link servers, all these wonderful things, right? We're not going to dive into every one of these too much, but there are also 11 other commandlets that are copy that I want you to be aware of that aren't in Start DBA Migration, and they're not there for good reasons, right? Some of these are agent ones. So think about it. If you're on a 2008 Express, or any Express edition, right, doesn't have the agent installed by default, doesn't have it on by default, right? So it's one of those things that if you're only in an agent environment, that's probably the only time you would want to have it. Also, some of these are very specific where you have to give it a name, and so it doesn't really fit into the wrapper module very well. There's some other ones here, such as DB assembly. I believe there's some reasons, I don't know off the top of my head why, but it would probably be dangerous to do that. Query store option, I feel like this one is a good candidate to go in there, but for some reason it hasn't been included yet. Although query store is kind of a newer feature, so I mean, I would imagine that would again be kind of like the agent job stuff. Copy DB table data is actually more just for copying data, right? It's not necessarily a migration thing. If you're moving the entire database, you don't need to use this inside of a Start DBA migration. And then again, with the SSIS catalog and the XE sessions template, you know, features that probably aren't on every single instance. So we're going to look at copy DBA database, and we are going to do the detach attach, right? So this is, you can do a reattach, but if you do a reattach, it reattaches it as read only. Right? So this would be something that you're like, we have a limited amount of downtime. These databases are small enough. This is our window. We're going to shut down this instance after we're done with it, or we want it to only be available to like double check that everything looks the same. So we're going to detach the databases, reattach them as read only so that no application actually reads against it, and all the data is over on this new instance. So in this scenario, we're actually going to put it to our 2017 box, which I had shown you before doesn't actually have anything on it. Which if we look at this again, right, there's nothing in there. There's no user databases. So we're going to go ahead and do this copy. And I did it with verbose just so that we could see what's going on in the background. So it's actually checking to ensure the source isn't the same as the destination, checking that the server is not SQL Server 7 or below because we don't support that, checking to ensure detach attach is not attempted on SQL Server below because we don't support that, checking to ensure detach attach is not attempted on SQL Server to a SQL Server 2012. Warning if it's from a 2005 to 2012. Ensuring the destination server version is equal to or greater than source. That's important. And then it goes ahead and starts building out the files that it's going to move. So we get the SQL file structure for these two databases. We start copying these databases over to check for accessibility if we can reach it. It does the detach, it does the alter statements, it copies it over, and then it successfully has already reattached it. And that took 18 seconds in my test environment. I copied DBA database with my other junior engineer to actually being like, oh, hey, it's all over there. It took like 15 minutes. And most of that was copy time because of those databases being larger. So now if we look at our two different instances, we can actually see that there's nothing on the 2008 instance, and everything is on the 2017 instance now, as far as databases go. So again, you can use this also for copy DBA login. This is one of my favorite ones, which you can actually use, again, taking that password and copying it over as well. And then if you have used copy DBA login in the past to kind of keep those up to date, I use it in like a availability group environment where I need to keep logins synced between two instances. You can actually use the sync DBA login permissions, which will look at the different credentials and kind of make sure that they're in sync with each other.
Is that syncing the SID? Or is it
It will, yes.
Okay.
So that it does that feature as well. And that's why I use copy DBA login, is so that if you create a SQL account, it has the identical SID on both instances, which is good. Thanks for the question. All right, so here's more or less something that we may take a look at. So what about offline migrations? What if you have a slow LAN link and you're like, we got to back this up, put it on a drive, ship it out to that site, and then they're going to restore it, and then we'll go do incrementals from there. Or say you're in an environment where you're like, hey, I want to put this into my QA environment, but I don't have a direct connection to it. I only have like a console access. You can actually use these, you can use backup DBA database to back up the actual files, but then you can use these export commandlets to actually export out T-SQL scripts that will set whatever objects are set on your environment to what other environments you execute this as. And of course, we wouldn't be doing a justice to you guys if we didn't have an easy button. So we actually have export DBA instance, which wraps up all of these export commands into its own commandlet. So if we go ahead and run that, we will see verbose on screen, and it's actually creating files. And if I actually, I'll wait for it to finish.
While that's running, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I noticed it was checking for AG group membership.
Yes.
So if you are migrating a database that is a member of an AG to another server that has availability group turned on, but there's no listener, there's no AG group there, is it going to bring that over and try and create a new listener and add it to a membership of a non-existing availability group?
I'm not actually sure on that. Maybe we could talk about it afterwards and take a look at your scenario. There are some AG-specific commandlets that can be used. So I would imagine you would need to make sure that that listener is available, that that is actually a node included in that availability group first.
Separately.
Yeah, that would be my assumption, because you would want to have multiple listener names the same.
Yep.
Yeah.
All those other setup parameters.
Yeah.
So you created an empty AG and then just inserted it into it?
I created an empty AG, and then I can talk to you about it after.
Yeah. So what we have here actually is, this is a folder structure that has all of these SQL scripts. And before you get excited about, hey, there's a database thing there, right? This actually is only really a script to restore your databases, right? So if there's a recent backup, which our new databases, which we have migrated, aren't there yet because we haven't backed them up yet, this would actually go out, find those files, and restore them back to their rightful place. So you'd have to make sure that those files are in place. But this is a way that you could basically potentially take a snapshot of what are the configs look like, and do I have a quick restore script that I could run to put those settings back in place. So that's one option. The last option that we can look at here really quick, and we aren't actually going to have time to run this, nor do I have the data sets required for this, is if you've ever used log shipping. Log shipping is a way that you could get massive databases over quickly. And what this does is, there's a lot of parameters for this commandlet you need to research on your own. But you basically set up source destination like we did on our other ones. You say what's your database, and then you need to have a share path to kind of put the logs so that it can run copies. And it actually sets up agent jobs on the source and destination, I believe. And it runs those agent jobs to kind of keep the logs syncing for however long you have set, whatever your time frame is. And so and this is called splatting if you're not familiar with the feature. And basically you would invoke DBA log shipping, and then once you're ready to recover, you would run DB log shipping recovery, and that would actually bring the database back online. All right, so let us finish off this talk.